Should Pokémon games have stayed 2D? This is a discussion I see all too often online, mostly by older fans that have been around long enough to see the main series evolve from cute 2D sprite worlds into the third dimension. But what if Pokémon remained 2D and Game Freak continued to hone the style they started off with? What would those games look like? And could they actually have been better than what we have today? Now you might be thinking, Munch, you're old man. Of course you like the 2D games more. And while I must admit that growing up with Gen 3 does give me some nostalgic bias towards the 2D sprite style, my goal with this video isn't to determine whether 2D or 3D looked better, as I believe in terms of visuals at least, the answer is really a matter of preference. Instead, I want to take you all on a journey through Pokemon history to examine how the shift to 3D impacted the games in more ways than just graphics, and hopefully by the end we'll have a better understanding of just how much this transition changed the core of our favorite monster catching series. So if you're excited for this trip down memory lane, don't forget to hit that like button, and let's begin with the dawn of this visual transformation. I suppose we should first establish when the shift to 3D happened exactly, and while most fans would say Pokemon X and Y were the first main series 3D games, we actually started seeing hints towards this future since way back in Gen 4. A lot of objects making up the environment of Sinnoh, like the buildings and mountains, were actually 3D. And the same goes for Heart Gold Soul Silver, where we even started seeing some of these objects in movement, but Pokemon Platinum took things to a whole nother level. The Distortion World was probably the first time I remember really being wowed by graphics in a Pokemon game. Surfing around these floating islands sideways and upside down while this swirling black hole spun in the background was pretty freaking mind-blowing as a kid. But of course things would get a whole lot crazier in Gen 5 with Pokemon Black and White, which introduced us to unforgettable locations like Castelia City. I still remember my first time crossing the Sky Arrow Bridge and seeing the camera angle shift from the top-down perspective every other Pokemon game had been so deeply rooted in. And when you finally reached Castelia City and the camera zoomed out to show off the magnitude of these massive skyscrapers, this was the moment I think Game Freak realized the potential of Pokemon in 3D. It might not look as impressive today, but at the time these graphics were pushing the limits of the Nintendo DS hardware they ran on. You see, at the time Pokemon Black and White came out in the States, the Nintendo 3DS had already been announced and the DS was basically on its final breath. This probably put some pressure on Game Freak to start improving their 3D capabilities for the next generation, as of course since they began making games, all they've really known is 2D sprite work. I mean, I guess technically Pokemon Colosseum and XD already existed, but those were developed by a different studio. So going back to Black and White, it took almost 2 years for the sequels to come out, and visually they didn't look too different from their predecessors, which makes me wonder if this whole time Game Freak was cooking up something entirely different in the background. It's well known at this point that in order to fulfill the less than ideal goals of producing at least one main series game per year, Game Freak appears to divide their workforce into separate teams for different projects. For example, in the most recent generation we had an A team working on Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, while the B team seemed to be working on Legends Arceus simultaneously, and that's likely why we saw a lot of ideas from Legends cross over into the Gen 9 games. I have a feeling in the years after Pokemon Black and White, with the 3DS looming overhead, a large part of Game Freak were designated to work on converting the animated sprites they'd worked so hard to perfect into 3D models. A monumental task considering how many Pokemon already existed at the time, and one that would prove if Game Freak could continue to stay at the top alongside other veteran Nintendo franchises that had successfully transitioned to the third dimension years ago. Thankfully for Game Freak, the hard work seemed to pay off, as when the first trailer of Pokemon X and Y came out, I definitely wasn't the only one that nearly lost my damn mind. When I first came up with the idea for this video, I kinda thought that X and Y were the first step in a downward spiral of quality for Pokemon games, but honestly, Gen 6 was kinda lit. I mean, Mega Evolutions alone were enough to cement it as a banger, but X and Y still had a lot of the qualities that made classic Pokemon games so fun to play over and over, and I think they get a lot of hate nowadays just for having the worst story. But after the magnum opus that was Pokemon Black and White's plot, it was gonna be hard to follow up regardless. In terms of graphics though, I think X and Y did a really good job of translating the aesthetic of classic Pokemon into the third dimension. The world looked amazing and full of little details that made me want to go search every nook and cranny for items and Pokemon. The characters somehow maintained the charm of the 2D sprites in the overworld while looking more realistic in cutscenes and battles. And then of course there were the actual Pokemon, which seemed to finally be realizing their true potential as we could now interact with the sprite creatures we all fell in love with in more engaging and immersive ways than we ever dreamed of. I know a lot of fans seem to think that X and Y were the beginning of the end in terms of difficulty as well, mainly because these were the first games that introduced the new style of EXP share, but at least back then, players weren't forced to use it, and I honestly don't even think that EXP share is why Pokemon games are so easy nowadays, but that's a topic for another video. Moving on to Pokemon Sun and Moon and their interesting sequels, honestly these games weren't all that bad either. Sure, I wasn't as big a fan of Z-moves as Mega Evolutions, and this gen did start the trend of introducing a new gimmick every generation, but most of the common complaints I hear with Pokemon today didn't really become apparent until Gen 8, when Pokemon seemed to face another rough transition from the comfort of our hands and into the realm of high-definition home consoles in Pokemon Sword and Shield. Well, technically Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee came first, but it feels like beyond just graphics, Game Freak were really trying to elevate the Pokemon experience this generation with the introduction of concepts like the wild area and, can't say it really worked for me. Going from the carefully thought out routes of previous regions where it felt like every little rock and flower was deliberately placed in the most aesthetic way, to this open, barren wasteland where objects feel more randomly generated and lacking any sort of cohesion with each other, coupled with Pokemon not spawning nearly as often as the trailers made it seem at least, and it makes the whole world somehow feel less alive than previous games where you couldn't even see Pokemon outside the grass yet. At least Pokemon Legends Arceus seemed to fix a lot of the problems I had with the more open concept of the wild area. It might be the fact that it's not an entirely open world and more like separate open areas, but even with hundreds of random items and Pokemon scattered about, it feels like everything belongs where it is, which is just not the same vibe I get with the wild area and open world of Paldea. But I feel like I'm getting off topic now, and as I mentioned, this seems to be more of a problem with the open world rather than Pokemon switching to 3D, though I suppose the two go hand in hand when it comes to explaining our next topic. Pokemon have never been strangers to trying out new features for one game and completely forgetting about it in future entries. I could list almost 100 ideas that could have been further developed and probably become series staples, but sadly just didn't get enough time in the oven. It feels like recently though, more often than not, these new ideas end up half-baked or just not as fun as those of games past. I mean, how many times are they gonna rehash the Pokemon Tower when all I want is another Battle Frontier? But without a doubt, the most notoriously cut feature were the Pokemon themselves. Everyone remembers the National Dex fiasco, right? I was never too adamant about it, to be honest, since I find collecting more than 400 Pokemon in a single game way too tedious. In fact, I don't remember ever completing the regional Dex in older games, so if anything, this was a pretty good change in my book. And it made some sense at the time considering the amount of work that goes into creating and animating every single Pokemon model, except for one little problem. They totally reused the models from X and Y. I've read some conflicting articles saying that Game Freak actually created new models for Sword and Shield, but data mines definitely suggest otherwise. Not that I really have a problem with them reusing old models, as it saves a lot of time that could be put towards other things like, sandwiches, I guess? This is my biggest gripe with the whole transition to home console. No, not the sandwiches, but rather the lack of fun features, specifically in the post-game compared to past generations. It's a sad reality, but a lot of the things that made Pokemon post-game so iconic back in the day are now reserved for the extra paywall known as DLC. I don't want to get super into the nitty-gritty of modern post games, or lack of them, but it just feels kind of wrong how little we seem to get now compared to past games, especially considering they used to cost less too. And if the updated graphics are supposed to be what makes up for this new price, then I think I would have rather kept the old school sprites and animations of black and white if it meant having more fun and challenging games. I know I've been pretty negative on the modern games so far, but it's not all bad, as the shift to 3D also brought along some of my favorite features in Pokemon, like the ability to customize our character. Technically, it was possible to add this feature back in the 2D games, like we've seen in some fan games, but the protagonist being 3D makes them so much more personalizable and definitely added to that feeling of immersion within the world of Pokemon. Even in games like Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, where we have just a few select outfits, every new playthrough feels a bit more unique by just wearing a different costume. Then Scarlet and Violet came along and totally ruined it by forcing you to wear a school uniform, but anyway. Another amazing addition that came with the 3D shift is the ability to interact with our Pokemon in ways that simply wouldn't have been possible if the game stayed 2D, or at least it wouldn't have felt nearly as engaging. Whether it's through picnics, camping, or good old-fashioned Pokemon and me, I absolutely adore being able to interact with these beloved creatures so many of us have bonded with, and seeing their reactions to getting pet on the head or even getting a ball thrown in their face. There's so many unique animations here, and I know Game Freak catches a lot of strays for reusing certain animations, but in general I feel like the Pokemon themselves look more alive than ever, especially in Scarlet and Violet. Sure, some signature moves, over-the-top animations seem to have been toned down when compared to Sword and Shield, but you could argue it makes battles snappier. Thinking about it, terastallizing feels like it takes forever sometimes. Yeah, I'm okay with move animations getting toned down a bit. Honestly, I wish we could just skip all these cutscenes, but you can really see just how much work Game Freak put into updating some of these models and animations with their love child Charizard, who might just have had the biggest glow up I've ever seen for a 3D Pokemon, and totally fits the personality I always imagined it having since way back in the Sprite days. While we're on the topic of updated designs, I want to end this whole segment with a bit of a trend I've noticed. Is it just me, or have starters become way more human-like? I'm not sure if it's because of the shift to 3D necessarily, but since Pokemon X and Y, I feel like the designs for starter Pokemon have gravitated towards a more humanoid aesthetic. Maybe it's just that humanoid characters are easier to rig and animate. I'm not really too knowledgeable in that field, so maybe animators can let me know in the comments, but it feels like even the more monster-based creatures have adapted human-like features. Perhaps player data showed that humanoid Pokemon were way more popular, so these type of designs became preferable. If you want my theory though, I'm pretty sure some of the higher-ups at Pokemon just realized half the fanbase are into that kind of thing. There's one more big change that came with the shift to 3D, and it's what some might call an over-reliance on regional gimmicks. I'm not trying to say I dislike the gimmicks per se. I mean, obviously I like some more than others, but nowadays it kind of feels like Game Freak think they absolutely need some kind of big twist to sell new games. I gotta imagine coming up with and designing these unique gimmicks every single new generation must be extremely time consuming, and another reason why Pokemon games feel like they get less content nowadays. What used to be these fleshed out regions with post games full of fun, challenging extra battles have literally been replaced by Terra raids, which some people find fun, sure, but it only lasts a couple hours till you catch it, and then you just wait till the next event. I guess my point with this whole segment is to illustrate just how much change we've gone through these last few generations, and what this constant innovation could mean for the future of Pokemon. Even with all the great features the shift to 3D has brought the Pokemon series, I still can't help but wonder what a modern day game might look like with the classic style. There are plenty of modern 2D games that look absolutely stunning and manage to hold their own even against major AAA titles, and it really makes me wonder what the series could have looked like if Game Freak continued to hone that art style. Maybe Pokemon games would have looked a little more like Octopath Traveler, which combined 2D sprites with 3D worlds and dynamic lighting to create a pretty visually impressive looking style. I've heard a lot of gamers dub this sort of look 2D HD, which makes a lot of sense as it feels somewhere between retro and modern, and it definitely suits the world of Pokemon. But what if instead Game Freak decided to scrap the pixelated sprites altogether and gone for a style closer to Nexomon, which uses hand-drawn anime-style artwork while maintaining the classic top-down perspective? I've always had a bit of an obsession with Ken Sugimori's artwork, and just imagining all the Pokemon animated in his style does sound pretty sick, but would sticking with what they knew have really benefited Pokemon in the long term? I mean, if it saves production costs by reusing certain assets, then I say why not? They could at least try it out with a future remake or spin-off title. But I also gotta admit, as a fan of Black and White, I would much rather see the iconic landmarks of Unova remade in a more grandiose way. So I'd like to propose an idea for the eventual Kalos remakes instead. For being on the 3DS, I would argue these games still look pretty good, especially when upscaled on emulators. The quality is honestly good enough to port to Switch as is. But let's not give Game Freak any ideas here. I think Pokemon X and Y might just be the perfect games to become the series' first demakes. And by that I mean taking the 3D world and turning it back in time to the top-down pixelated era. I think it'd be really interesting to see how some of the more open areas of modern games could be adapted to fit the old style. And how awesome would it be to get official sprites for some of the newer Pokemon? Then again, there's plenty of other games out there continuing to push the limits of pixel art in ways that honestly blow my mind, so you guys keep doing what you're doing, and I guess we'll let Pokemon keep doing whatever this is. To try and answer the question I started this whole video with, should Pokemon have stayed 2D? I still feel like it's up to preference, but if I absolutely had to choose, then I'd honestly have to say no. While I would have loved to see what the series could have looked like if they continued honing that 2D style, or even gone for the hand-drawn approach since I've always been a fan of Sugimori's art, I can't deny that a lot of that desire is driven by nostalgia. Without this transition, we wouldn't be able to interact with our beloved creatures in all the ways that the modern style allows us to. Pokemon Go would have never existed. There might not have been a Detective Pikachu movie. Would the trading cards still have been as popular as they've become? And most importantly, would the new generation of players have been interested in a game that feels outdated in the eyes of modern gaming? You may have noticed I used the term evolution a few times throughout this video, both as a pun because, you know, Pokemon evolve, but also because the shift to 3D really feels like the natural evolution of the series. And as I pointed out, I think a lot of the real problems plaguing the core games today seem to be more of a systematic issue. Unreasonable expectations of releasing a game every single year and the constant obsession with wanting to create new features every generation instead of improving on things that worked makes it feel like Pokemon is always taking one step forward and two steps back. The games undoubtedly have a lot of work still poured into them, and I can see the improvements being made, but it's just so slow compared to other contemporary franchises that get so many more years to polish and perfect their games. I believe one day we'll get to see that open world experience we all dream of, but at the rate they're going, we might just have to wait like 10 more generations. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and please let me know if there's any other topics in the Pokemon world you'd like me to discuss. I've been wanting to create more analytical or video essay style content for a while now, and I figured this would be a good place to start since it's a topic I'm quite passionate about. But I'm not gonna lie, it was quite a struggle figuring out how to approach this whole thing. Like, do I just give my opinions or try to take a more unbiased analytical approach? In the end, I think I settled somewhere in the middle, so let me know if there's anything you think I could improve. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't yet to stay tuned for all my future content.